Well, good afternoon, everybody, and you're all very welcome to this Friends of Europe Policy Insight. And good afternoon to everybody joining us online as well. My name is Luke O'Callaghan-White, and I'm the Programme Manager here at Friends of Europe for our Climate, Energy and Sustainability Programme. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. There are no fire alarms scheduled today, so if you hear one, please exit through the door you entered. And while you're, of course, now checking to make sure that your phones are on silent, no need to turn them off. You're most welcome to join the discussion on Twitter, and you can use the hashtag FoEDebate and hashtag SSHCenter, which you can see behind me. Also, I'm going to be coming to you for your thoughts, your comments, your questions, and your insights. So do get thinking over the course of the hour or so. And the questions you wish to pose to our esteemed panel, which I'm delighted to say we're joined by three excellent speakers today. I also wanted to quickly thank my colleagues in a range of departments for making this event possible. In particular, thanks to my colleague Julia, who made this event possible in its truest sense. As I say, I'm delighted that we're joined by a trio of excellent speakers. Kersty Hobson joins us online. Kersty's a reader at Cardiff University School of Planning and Geography. Malgorzata Golebiewska is the team leader for Environment Footprint and the European Commission at DG ENV, and she's joining us here. And we also joining us in the studio here, Cristina Ganapini, the coordinator at the Right to Repair Europe. Before I move to our panel for an opening question, I just want to draw attention to the SSH project. Friends of Europe is delighted to be one of the 13 organizations part of the SSH Center Consortium, which is the new Center of Excellence for Social Sciences and the Humanities, which is across the Horizon Europe Cluster 5 program, which focuses on climate, energy, and mobility. I think it might be useful to start our discussion today with a little bit of context about what a linear economy is, what a circular economy is, and why it matters. So, of course, for the last 250 years, the European economy has been based on the model of continuous growth. But we know that the Earth's ecosystems are buckling under this insatiable demand for more natural resources. Habitats are fragmenting, pollution is having far-reaching negative effects on health and on biodiversity, and more expansive land use is decreasing the planet's ability to use carbon sinks. So if these traditional linear models of production continue based as they are on the idea of take, make, consume, throw away pattern, we'll soon be extracting raw materials at a rate far beyond all planetary boundaries. But the circular economy, in contrast, is a model of production on consumption, which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling materials to really extend the life cycle of products for as long as is possible. And this represents really a paradigm shift in how we think about economy in Europe. The whole value chain we design in a regenerative nature. And so the circular economy should disconnect natural resources and environmental impacts from economic activity, and therefore in application, waste and pollution are designed out of the economic model. So important pillars of circularity, such as waste prevention, eco-design, and reuse, tackle these problems at source. And they can offset biodiversity loss, curb levels of pollution, limit the overexploitation of species, and reduce production costs. So this will be important from a competitiveness perspective as well as all these other co-benefits of moving towards circularity. And probably all in this room and online are familiar with the flagship initiative of the current Commission is the Green Deal. And the Commission President has pledged that Europe will become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And moving to a circular economic model of production and consumption will be key in this respect. And in March 2020, when the pandemic was taking over our lives, the Commission also launched the Circular Economy Action Plan 2.0. And this plan contains 35 various action points and initiatives that are designed to close the loop between in the circular economy. And the Commission now is in the process of effectively completing this implementation process, and there's still a lot to discuss and to consider as the institutional negotiations continue, from green claims to the right to repair, and measures to reduce microplastic pollution, the proposal for eco-design, for sustainable product regulation. There's a lot of material there. So I think before we hear from the experts on some of these matters in more detail, it's important to set the scene, have an understanding of what we mean by circular economy, and the importance of addressing this question, yes, at the production side, but also looking at what consumers can do to help close this loop. So, Kirsty, I might start with you if I can. We're speaking about closing the loop and the need to reimagine consumption and empower consumers. Could you give us your sense really on which mix of policies are necessary to incentivize this reimagination of consumption? So we're not hearing you now. We can. Back to good quality.
Okay. Is that okay? Right.
Yep.
And I'm also an echo of myself, so that's very strange. I'll try not to be put off by it. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to be quite annoying and perhaps do that academic thing where I don't directly address the question, but take you on a bit of a journey with me to investigate, which is to think about what we mean by reimagining consumption and empowering consumers. Because without that, I don't think we ever get to a sensible mix of policies. So it's always good to think about our basic premises and our basic assumptions before we go jumping in to particular policy interventions. And so I just wanted to start off by maybe just sort of throwing some thoughts out there for us to consider. And that is, what do we mean by empower? We all obviously have some intuitive sense of what that word means.
It can mean providing tools and the spaces, and also the social legitimacy of creating spaces where latent desires and willingness can be enacted. So, for example, we might think about empowering women through education. So there we have a desire to be educated and be part of society, which is then facilitated and enabled and realised. The reason I'm saying that is because I think we are perhaps a bit wrong by suggesting that this is about empowering consumers. I don't think it ends up in terms of what empowerment means.
So what I mean is that what are we taking as evidence that somehow there is a latent desire in the public
to participate in the economy? So I'll just quickly go back to a study that came out in 2019, that was headed up by Europe. And this is probably to date the most comprehensive study done of what the European public has the circular economy. So there was 15 years, 12,000 questionnaires and 6,000 surveys done using experimental methods. And what we saw there was very big gap between consumers' stated willingness and desire and their actual behaviour. So that survey showed us many things, including over 90% of people who said they would be interested in borrowing, renting and buying second-hand. 90% had not actually done that. The figures were better for repair. I think about 64% of people said they had
done some repairing, but a lot of that was a long time ago. So here we have the classic value action. And we have known about this for a long time. I've been looking at this field in terms of consumer behaviour for 25 years. And pre-circular economy, pre-climate emergency, we knew the value action existed, which is basically, no matter what people say they value, in a kind of big picture, abstract sense, when it comes to actual practices, we don't always act out. And basically, it's a question of many things, including statements. So my question is, how salient do we think the underlying imperatives of the circular economy are to the average person within Europe and the UK? So if you look at the story that you, it's very, very added to words and very true. But are we assuming here that actually it's compelling and true, and there's a strong desire, strong imperative from the average citizen to act? Now you may be sitting there thinking, hold on a second, we all know about climate change. We all know about ecological collapse and insulting consumers. Not in any way at all. What I'm saying is that there is, in our brains and in the way we live out, a big difference between the value of high-level values and then how we act around the mundane. So you may care a lot about climate change, but if that is not salient when you're going to buy it, if it's not in your mind, you will not act on it. So the question is always, how do we bridge that value action plan? And what my work has been doing in the last decade is actually saying that I think the model of the consumer at the heart of the circular economy, as it's enacted in a lot of places, is too simplistic. And I didn't go as far as to say, I think it's a very convenient sort of story of consumer sovereignty, of consumer freedom, of material choice. And also kind of, setting the apple cart in terms of budgeting. But I do believe, and I've certainly found in my own research, that people, particularly consumers in the global north, who go into the shop or a supermarket and are surrounded by diverse material abundance, the imperative of the circular economy just does not resonate. So that is where we need to start with policy, is to actually pick, is the basic sociological premise of the circular economy salient to people? And if not, how do we make it so? I think we've missed a step in the whole agenda by not actually being very public, being very loud, and being very clear about what is underlying the circular economy. It's not just about nice new business model and making profit. It's actually about a very clear imperative of resource constraint world and a very uneven world. So to come back, I'll stop soon, to come back to the original question about policy, I think it's more about the first step is to actually reframe the circular economy public discourse about being something that is connected to change and socio-ecological finance, and isn't just about making things more convenient and right for consumers. Because I think if we jump straight to that, we'll actually always have a value action gap. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much for that. There's a huge amount of food for thought there. Sorry to have to hear your voice as an echo. That's always disconcerting, but really, really clear. And there was a little bit of reverb in the room, but we got the points very clearly. I mean, it brings up questions that I know we'll return to a little later in the debate. Have we missed a step? Basic questions, what we mean about empower, given the context that Kersty has so eloquently outlined, and have we also overlooked the psychological question as the value action gap, which Kersty outlined? I think these are all really important questions for further consideration as well. But I might move maybe to the EU perspective, and if I can turn to you, Malgorzata. It's clear that the Circular Economy Action Plan is an important pillar for the Commission and for the EU as a whole. Could you tell us a bit more about what tools that the EU has, excuse me, to support more sustainable consumption and production? And if you could just elaborate perhaps on the role of methods to measure some of the footprints of environmental footprints of products.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to all the participants in the room and also online. And thank you for this intervention from the first speaker, from Kersty. It was really, really interesting, and I think laid really good foundation for the follow-up discussion. I mean, the Circular Economy Action Plan indeed is a cornerstone within the EU. Already the first plan that was adopted back in 2014, and now the follow-up where we really, really kick-started the discussion, even though the resource efficiency, of course, is not a new concept, and the Commission worked on that already before. It's clear in the strategic documents that the Commission adopted in the past few years, starting also with the Green Deal and the climate neutrality objectives and the role of new business models and how circular economy can support our transformative objectives towards more sustainability, but also keeping the EU economy competitive on the global markets. So these strategic documents very clearly identify that we need to act upon different pillars, and production is one big pillar, but of course the way we consume and then how we dispose of our goods is are another two pillars that are equally important. So our action and the mix of policies that we've been putting in place actually are targeting all the three areas. It was really interesting to hear from the previous speaker about the fact that maybe we didn't get the role of consumer exactly in the center of attention, and I think there's a reason for that. In our view, the consumer has an important role to play, but is not the most important player at first, because the consumers will only choose what they can choose. They can only buy products that are put on the market, and they also have to base their decisions on credible information that they can rely on and that they can also compare. So that's why within the mix of policies addressing the standards and the eco-design for sustainable product regulation, the latest, not the latest, but an important proposal from last year that is negotiated with the institutions, we put so much attention to the fact that products have to be designed better in a more circular way. So that's clearly going to change the market. But then, as a second step, we want to ensure that consumers get the information they need. Whether the term empower is appropriate, maybe not, but the consumers can only take decisions on the basis of the information they get, and if nobody really has oversight over what producers and how producers communicate to consumers, I think we're then certainly missing the opportunity and also undermining the trust. So that's where the more recent proposals, first of all, the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition from last year, which amends the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that enters into play with the definition of environmental claim and setting some general principles of what companies should not do in order not to mislead consumers when it comes to environmental claims. But then the most recent proposal, the for a Green Claims Directive, is a complementary instrument whereby we actually want to tell companies what they should do to substantiate their claims. So not only prohibiting them from some actions, but also giving them and also the enforcement authorities the tools to actually clarify how this should be done. So that's the focus of the Green Claims proposal that we're working on now. So again, we maybe indeed the empowering is not the right term, but still the consumers actually have to be helped. And they can be helped twofold by getting the products, having the right choice of products, and also by getting the right information. And here that brings me to the second question that has just been asked about the environmental footprint and how can we calculate the environmental footprint of products in a more coherent, consistent, and also robust way. So the Commission has been working on this methodology for over 10 years, the environment footprint methods. End of 2021, the Commission adopted an update of the method by a recommendation. So it remains a valid tool, a valid methodology to evaluate the life cycle impacts of products, services, and also organizations. While the Green Claims proposal does not prescribe the use of this method, the method is clearly identified as one method that can be used to credibly substantiate the claims about environmental impacts and specifically the life cycle claims. So here we definitely see an important role. The methodology still needs to be improved and developed, and that's what we clearly indicated in the proposal. But the tool is there, and the Commission is there to promote its use by companies, but also in EU policies, in different sectoral policies. But maybe I stop there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. There's a lot there, and it's always going to be challenging when you need to address several pillars at the one time. I think that gets back to the question about a whole of society approach to climate change and our environmental obligations as well. It's interesting to hear that we've had a common thread already from the two speakers that we've heard of, which is really that there's a limitation to how empowered a consumer can be in the current context in which we find ourselves in the market structures. So I would also encourage audience members to start thinking of questions and comments that you might have, because I'm going to be coming to you in just a moment. But first, if I can turn to you, Cristina, I think we when we're thinking about what the core of a circular economy is, I think we want to keep the lifespan of products in use for as long as possible. So I'm thinking about the ideas of repair and the right to repair, which is an initiative that we've seen recently as well from the Commission. You know, what are the existing barriers that you find in your work to the right to repair, and what could help citizens make better decisions when it comes to repairing a product that they have, or maybe looking if it's now the right time to purchase a new one? So interested in your thoughts on that one.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for the organization, for the participation of everyone. Maybe to introduce repair a little bit, we can go back to the waste hierarchy. That is something that everyone agrees upon, but then when we have to implement it, it looks a bit confused. So the waste hierarchy goes, we should reuse first, then repair, then recycle. This is in an ideal world, that's what we prioritize. So this is why repair is important from an environmental perspective, because most of the environmental impact of, for example, electronic devices happens during the manufacturing phase, not during the use. So it becomes very logical that the longer you use it, the longer you dilute the environmental impact over time, and the less you need to extract more and produce more. So this is why we go for repair. And we have lots of evidence of why we need to repair much, much more to save lots of emissions, resources, you name it. So this is maybe why we want to do it. But also, consumers are hugely in favor of a right to repair, a right to get their stuff repaired, because they aren't necessarily big fans of wasting money, just in general. And we can see it on, for instance, the latest Eurobarometer. Almost 80% of people were in favor. Like, you can see it everywhere. So this brings me back to maybe Kersty's comment, which was there's a gap between what consumers actually say they should do or think they should do and what they actually do. In my opinion, the gap is that if you have ever dropped your phone and you've tried to get it repaired, you know that even if you try, it's very hard. So there are a lot of barriers that are still in place. So in my opinion, the problem here is really more on the offer side, less on the demand side, because people really want and really try. So what are the problems? I'm also going to cover a little bit the Right to Repair initiative, which was published fairly recently. I know this is not exactly Malgorzata's focus, but it's still important. So what we lack in legislative terms is a universal right to repair. The right to get your stuff repaired by the provider of your choice. A large offer, because if we don't have a large mainstream offer, it's going to be very hard to find repair solutions and very expensive. So in our opinion, we really need to have a broad offer of repair services, and there shouldn't be legislative, propriety, copyright, contractual, software, hardware restrictions, and we have all of them, and they are not really being addressed. Then we really need to address, in legislative terms, anti-repair practices, because we have so many, and sometimes they spill over into early obsolescence practices. Software practices are becoming a bit insane, to be honest, to the point where to just substitute any component of any device that a consumer has purchased, you really need almost the authorization of the Pope. It's really not reasonable and makes it very, very complicated, costly, unnecessarily difficult. Then you have the affordability issue, which is, again, not tackled anywhere. We can talk eco-design, we can talk right to repair initiative, we can talk empowering consumers initiative, green claims, not the scope, but not there either. We're never addressing, in legislative terms, the price of spare parts, the price of getting your stuff repaired. If manufacturers have the chance to restrict what parts you use via software, for instance, there is no competition for spare parts, and you can just get the spare parts by the manufacturers. If the manufacturers are in a linear economy mentality and not in a circular one, they're going to make it very expensive so that you buy a new device. And this is early obsolescence, and this is what we're trying to fight. But in our opinion, you're never going to empower the consumers, or you're never going to enable even the consumers to do the right thing if repair is not economically viable, or is not, if buying a cheap new thing, which was produced mining lots of new materials and often even exploiting human resources, that violating human rights, if that is so much cheaper than getting things repaired, we cannot really blame the consumers for not getting it repaired. So I would say the bottom line is we really need to address the affordability of repair. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. And I think that does dovetail with a theme that's emerging already, is the desire, the gap between capacity and intention, and really what is available to a consumer to ensure that we close the loop between in the circular economy. And I'm sure we'll come back to it. Interesting that you brought up the raw material point, because I certainly have a question about that I'd like to pose to you. But now is the time to turn it over to you, our audience here. Andy has a mic, so if you want to raise your question, we have one at the front, and we'll come to you, sir, at the back. And do keep your hands up, and I can see who's interested in posing questions. But we'll start with yourself.
I just sit, I think it's not needed. Okay, I'm Stefano Spinaci, and I work in the European Parliamentary Research Service. I disclaim I speak on my own, so it's not the position of the European Parliament or the European Parliamentary Research Service. Thanks for the presentation. The first thing, when we spoke about the hierarchies, Cristina, you said reuse, repair, and recycle. I totally agree. I think we should introduce more and more also the concept of sufficiency and frugality, which should go even up than reuse. And some member states, especially one, France, for some subject, is trying to introduce. It's politically it's very difficult, economically it's very difficult, but I think we have to start to speak about that also to citizens and consumers. About the repair and reuse, I think we should rethink the way, our life is organized. So working time is one of the subjects. If we reduce working time, most probably we have more time to dedicate to these activities. But also the infrastructure that we could have, for example, if we live in a city. So places where you can go to repair things with some shared equipment. Or even fiscal policies, kind of taxation policy. So you get a lower taxation if you buy something that is second-hand, or you get fiscal incentives, and this is done, for example, in Austria, if you repair things. So you have a kind of voucher, but I think that you know more than me. Going back to the subject of sufficiency, and I apologize, it's a bit long. I think it's very important because we speak always about the sovereignty, no? So it's become a buzzword here in Brussels. But sovereignty passes also through the concept of sufficiency, because we are a continent. We don't have raw material. We don't have energy. We should think to this also in an optic of autonomy, or strategic autonomy. Sorry. I go through my... Yeah, and the other thing is when we speak about cheap new things, that we have all the big subject of how the carbon pricing, because why we have all these cheap things, simply because the price doesn't reflect the externalities that can be carbon or other human rights and so on. Okay, I think it's just enough.
Comprehensive list to deal with there. Thank you. We might take a second question and come back to the panelists. Thank you. So back here. We're going to come back to you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Miran Petersky. I am professional services advisor and former economic policymaker. Just one short question. Commission has a right of initiative and to show a leadership. Even if it doesn't work, but at the end, but it gives a good incentive And as a colleague before mentioned, just simply, one of the means is introducing a taxation on a tax level on all products that cannot be repaired. And this is quite simple. Or if you don't do that, what other means did you use? Where did you show leadership? Because consumers will be happy. We are in Europe repatriating production. So we don't want to have too much waste. And so on and so on. We don't want to use too much energy. And the list is very long. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question, and do keep thinking, because I'm going to be coming back to you all in just a moment. I might pose this first one to you, Kersty, and I want to take some of the many thoughts that Stefan outlined there as well. And he spoke about, you know, the benefits and the co-benefits of reducing working time, the question around infrastructure and access if you're not living in a city, the question around cost, which was also touched on by Cristina, introducing fiscal incentives, for example, the case study of Austria, and not at the current moment being able to fully acknowledge the externalities that go into what we have as cheap end results in Europe. But I want to return to the first point that he made around sufficiency. And I wonder if you could link this with your research, particularly from a psychological landscape. We know you spoke about the value action gap. And could you speak about sufficiency? Is this something that we can convince the public of as an asset?
That's a very good question. I was really happy to hear sufficiency brought up so quickly, because it's a point I want. The second speaker spoke about the not being the most important part of the circular economy. I would like to disagree very strongly with that. I think the consumer is the linchpin, because it's not just about buying. So yes, they buy what is made, and they only have the choice to choose. But the circular economy actually is about, I think it should be about, reimagining our entire relationship with the material that we have around us. So it's actually about buying less. So if we think it's just about making products more efficient and more transparent, what we're going to fall into is what we're already into, is the massive rebound effect. So yes, you can make one product more efficient, clearly labeled, but actually products sit in a whole ecosystem of products that are in the shops and in the house. So one product might be better, but actually then any money might be spent on various activities. We already know that the rebound effect, if you look at it, circular economies, is a massive problem. The only way to really tackle that is to reduce the absolute levels of consumption. And that is not something that mainstream I've got terrible circular economy policy wants to talk about, because it's very, and coming to that second point about leadership, I do wonder where those difficult conversations are going to actually take, because they are difficult. We're basically saying to people, we've all had access to too much stuff too long. At some point, this has to stop. And the first question, about what's going on in France, I think there are levers to encourage people and to bring people in. And it doesn't necessarily have to be linked to the circular economy. So, for example, in Wales, I'm based in Wales, I'm here in Wales. The Welsh government now setting up reuse and repair hubs in community. Now, Wales is a very dispersed country. We have urban centres in the south, but the north is pretty rural. So that's a big ask. And it's also about getting volunteers from the community to come and be involved. And so far, it's really resonating with people, because it's not just about, can I repair my toaster? It's actually about, coming together as a community to actually, rethink how we can, what I'm trying to say, the place that material culture has in our life that has displaced social relations.
I think you.
Sorry.
No, you've touched on a number of really valid points there, and I think you've mentioned yourself, it's a series of difficult conversations that we need to have, and that everything that we're discussing itself exists in an ecosystem, which I think brings us to the second question. One of the tools in that ecosystem is around taxation. And Malgorzata, if I can come to you on this, if you can speak about the idea of introducing a tax on all products that themselves cannot be repaired. I'm conscious that there are a number of DGs and units working on this, but if it's something you can let us in on.
If you can, yes, you can hear me. Thank you for the question. I think it comes in the right moment, certainly, in this debate and discussion. So just on the role of consumers, maybe my message didn't get across too well. I wasn't meant to say that it's not the most important part, because we identify this one of the key pillars within the circular economy. But I think in the past we have seen the industry putting the blame on consumers too much, on the overconsumption and the fact that they're just delivering on the demand rather than actually taking an active role and changing that demand and offering better products and also looking at the new business models. So that's why I think the Commission is very much focused on the production side, but not leaving aside completely the consumption side, where, of course, the proposals we have put on the table are there, and then we're also supporting many actions on the consumption side as well. So that was a little bit the intention of my intervention at the beginning. When it comes to the taxation policy, of course, that is a very important instrument to drive demand, and this we acknowledge in any discussions we are having with the Member States and the European Parliament. It's just that at the EU level, the Commission has limited competence when it comes to taxation. But it doesn't mean that we have no means of influencing these decisions by the Member States. And for example, we're doing so by setting different targets that the Member States can deliver upon only if they also reform their taxation systems. So for example, just to give an example from the area of waste policy, where increasingly we are promoting targets on reuse. The recent proposal on for packaging regulation actually puts forward targets on reuse of packaging for the first time. So that truly supports the waste prevention objective, so the highest on the waste hierarchy. And here, Member States, in order to deliver on this objective, we also have to rethink how they incentivize companies via fiscal incentives. So that's just one example. When it comes to overall the question of incentives, certainly the Commission promotes different fiscal instruments that the Member States should be taken. I mean, we're in close conversation, but as said, there is a certain limit. In the climate area, we have the emissions trading scheme, so that's a pricing mechanism as well. So we're trying to introduce different economic measures to support the transition towards more circularity, and also to support the objectives that we have set ourselves on climate. But I appreciate that indeed it would have been much better to have an EU-wide harmonized taxation on products that would support the objectives. But I think in the current setup of the competence within the European Union, that would be rather difficult.
Well, thank you. I'm going to come back to the audience in just a moment, so do keep thinking and grab my attention, and we'll bring a mic to you. Cristina, we're talking about incentives, about the limits of incentives. I know that I have been incentivized many times after having dropped my phone in a puddle or in a sink for a universal right to repair that phone. But you also mentioned in your earlier answer the question of raw materials. And you said that the primary barriers to repair for consumers really landed in the supply side. So I think in the context of, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act, which the Commission have proposed earlier this year, And in thinking about the value chain and the externalities, which was a question raised earlier, and we're taking a true account of the labor cost, the climate cost, the environmental cost, and so forth, could you maybe reflect a little further on the critical raw materials, the context of supply, the issues that we have in Europe, and the imperative of having longer life cycles for some of these new e-technologies that we're going to need in the coming decades?
With pleasure. I'll go into the raw materials, and maybe I'll conclude coming back to the tax incentives, because it's just too good not to go into. Talking about raw materials, of course, I mean, the Commission, everyone is really recognizing the fact that we are going to struggle, because so many sectors will be in competition for the same raw materials, which we don't really have in Europe, except we do have them in landfills. We do have lots of waste. We do produce lots of waste, and that waste, especially e-waste, is really filled with those very raw materials that we are struggling to get. So does it make sense to throw out devices that have all these raw materials and to shred them, to recycle them, whereas by substituting just one little part we could have saved it and just kept using that raw material? So we're coming back to the main idea of why repair is so central, because from a point of view of strategic autonomy, of sufficiency, it's really important, and it doesn't really make sense to do anything else really than following the waste hierarchy. So going back to, so how do we do it? So for instance, there were some ideas about tax incentives, and this is something that we're talking about I'm talking about quite a lot to the Commission all the time, because we were hoping to see something going in this direction in the right to repair proposal. Unfortunately, we were disappointed. Austria was mentioned previously. France is also doing it. Germany, the state of Thuringia is also doing it. They are all success stories. I actually told the commissioner, Mr. Reinders, these are all success stories in member states. Why not doing it at EU level? His answer was, these are success stories at member state level. So why doing it at EU level? It's working so well at member state level. Well, because it could work well in all 27 states. This would be my invitation. So if it works so well at member state level, maybe we should find a way around the competence issues, find a way that works. For instance, how is France doing it? France is financing their repair fund, which is basically subsidizing people to go repair their stuff rather than replacing it. They are financing this via EPR schemes, so extended producer responsibility fees. We could do something about it at EU level, but for the moment we seem to lack the actual conviction to act upon it seriously in policy and legislative terms, and we are pushing for it now at Parliament level, of course.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that answer. There was a question in the second row here. We'll bring a microphone to you. Thanks.
Hello, Doreen. Is this working? No.
It should be.
Is it? The lights on.
I don't think it's connecting.
Maybe if I spin it that way.
No, it should have the virtual connection.
Otherwise I can shout.
Sure.
Yeah? I don't know if Kersty will be able to.
I'll be able to relay it to Kirsty, but thank you.
So
Yeah.
I won't shout at everybody. Hello, my name is Doreen Federigo from Climate Action Network Europe. I wanted to explore more the reimagining consumption than the circular economy, if we could.
I think we have a microphone just in time.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, is this working?
Great.
Kirsty, can you hear me? And well, everybody else online. It's just that you're the only person I can see. Doreen Federigo from Climate Action Network Europe. And I wanted to explore much more the reimagining consumption than the circular economy. And the reason for that partly is, we already know we have increasing urgency in the ecological, social, geopolitical situations that we're living in. And those need policy developments that really truly address the source of the problems that we're facing, which is the overconsumption of resources in industrialized or industrializing countries. But the other thing to say is in increasing inequality, okay? And the other thing is obviously these unsustainable patterns of consumption and production and consumption, sorry. So we've been talking about product policy for 25 years. In the late 1990s, we talked about integrated product policy. Around 2008, we talked about sustainable consumption and production. We were already doing studies from DG Environment on rebound effect, and we're still having the same conversations in which we're talking about giving information to the consumers because they're rational decision makers, homus economicus, which we know doesn't exist. And so I feel like these little steps forward are further and further away from what we really need. And if we look at what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we had Repower EU that said 15% less gas consumption. So you had member states who were dealing with limiting air conditioners. We had grounding of short-haul flights, banning them. We had grounding of private jets, etc. And for me, all of that and beyond really needs to come from the European Union. So I guess we as civil society organizations, we certainly as CAN Europe, will be preparing this as part of our work towards the next elections. But for me, it's not about how do you sell sufficiency or how do you talk to people about sufficiency. It's about talking to them about equality and solidarity and what is socially and societally acceptable behavior. So the whole 1% that makes the massive impacts, we're not talking about that at all. And I think what will come if the European Union has the guts to really stand up to these kinds of issues and really create, a 21st century European experiment, then what will come, maybe a bit more easily, is the taxation incentives and changes, etc. But if what we're going to do is talk purely about, and I'm part of it, what is the resources reduction target for the EU and how do we link it to the climate neutrality target, then we're lost. We're still in engineering mode. We are not talking to the people that are looking for answers from somewhere, and we know where they're really starting to look through their elections. So please, Malgorzata, go back to, President von der Leyen and say maybe we need, a boost to the European Green Deal. That was it. Not really a question, but maybe welcoming, a bit more discussion. Thank you.
No, thank you. We'll pick up on this in just one moment, get the panel's perspective, but there was a question in the front row as well. We'll bring a microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Alex from Sustainable Public Affairs. In brief, we only do climate positive lobbying. My thunder has been stolen a little bit by the preceding question. It was related to the elections because what I'm hearing for most of the questions is we actually have a lot of the answers. There's not really missing pieces. What we need to build is the political momentum and saliency. So I think the Green Deal of this mandate has been a good step in the right direction, but I would really appreciate the panel's advice on how we now take that next step and get it to the level of saliency as we see with climate, where we now have 2030 targets, we're going to have a 2040 target, we're going to have a 2050 target, we have a carbon budget. How do we get to that level for the circular economy, for example, a budget on material use, etc., etc.? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot there. Malgorzata, I am struck by the previous comment. We saw the EU act swiftly in response to a crisis, and it was across the board. And Cristina, you mentioned speaking with Commissioner Reinders. I think we have at least the beginnings of recognizing that, well, there are a variety of different DGs looking at this question of circular economy. So maybe that's a footstep. But linking the point that is, I think, maybe not raised sufficiently enough is the development of policies regarding the environment, which often seem as though they're in tension or portrayed as if they are in tension with some of the climate and energy goals that the EU has already introduced and is continuing to develop. But do you think, from the Commission's perspective, I have two questions to put at you, kind of synthesizing what we've heard just now. Do you think, one, that we can envisage a Repower EU-like momentum shift towards this, realizing the circular economy? Do you think that's feasible? And secondly, do you think that we should be perhaps viewing this through the prism of equality and justice rather than consumption and production habits?
Thank you for the questions. To be fair, I'm not sure I'm the right person to respond to these questions, and I doubt that the President of the Commission will listen to me. I think she will listen to the voters, and she will listen to the Parliament. When, if in case she or another candidate for the Commission President is to run for re-election, there needs to be pressure from the side of the parliamentarians who will be there to either grant that mandate or not. So I think the real key to success is to convince the society to vote for the right people who have that message, because I mean, I think the European Green Deal, how that came to surface and how quickly that agenda completely overshadowed any previous agendas that we have seen under previous Commission presidents, shows that if there is political will, there's a way. So that's, I think, as much as I can say at this stage, and then once there is political will, of course, the Commission then works to deliver on the objectives. So I think we have done a big milestone with the Green Deal, the climate neutrality targets. We are actually the global trailblazers. I'm not saying it's enough. We probably have to carry on, but then for that we need a political mandate to do so, and we need to actually convince the society that this is the right way, and that we all have to be ready to adjust.
Great, thank you. Kersty, I might turn to you next, and I might add to the range of comments that we've heard there. Firstly, I'd be particularly interested to hear your thoughts on the two comments that we've just received, and perhaps if you can reflect on the role of incentives, behaviour change, and the upcoming European election next year. But also, I was reading, you produced a publication earlier this year which showcased some findings for practical guidance for scholars to engage with policymakers on circular economy. I wonder if it's possible kind of to elaborate on some of those findings as we begin to wrap up our debate here.
Sure. I mean, I just want to say the first speaker talking about equality. I mean, I wrote it down here, and I mentioned inequality, because I think in terms of relevance with the public, we have to go back and ask ourselves, what is consumption for? And it's a mistake to think that we as consumers just want visibility. We often consume for a checking of our social status, a connection with other people, practice of consuming. And then if you compare that to luxury consumption and the excessive wealth in the world, we can see a real imbalance about the possibility of going back to that discourse of blaming the consumer. It's right. We do not want to be in a position where you have, you know, the not wealthy members of feeling like a finger being wagged. And I recently got my students to write say, should we tax luxury consumption? Is that one of the really key things that we can do? And the student said, yes, but how do we do it? How do we do it in a world where government is as it is, and we have such capacity for wealth out of the EU? Sorry, that wasn't the question, but I just at that point, I totally agree that it isn't about me. And us humans are very finely tuned in terms of justice. So we can't ignore that. So coming back to the question, Luke, could you repeat your second bit of your question? Sorry.
You've given a great overview there, but the second question was based on the paper which you wrote earlier this year and some of the practical findings for how academics can engage with policymakers and political leaders on implementing material related to the circular economy development.
Right, yeah. It is actually quite a lot of what I've been saying already. In terms of, so for example, talking to the Welsh government, very much around how interventions are framed. So if one is coming in very much from a kind of technical circular economy perspective, you lose a lot of people because they feel that it's not within the kind of realm of what they do to be able to present that. So certainly, you know, in conversations I've had about this, it is very much about. So actually, almost taking the technicality of the circular economy out of it, I'm thinking about, well, where are the places, the legal points in society that actually we can address this reimagining of consumption alongside other co-benefits in terms of, like I said, about the repair hubs, the co-benefits in terms of society and, you know, mental health are very clear in the list. So it's not necessarily that you come at it with a whole suite of new policies, whole suite of new ideas. It's actually looking at what we have and multiplying them in terms of co-benefit. So I'm a big fan of evidence-based repair because I do think that is something that resonates with people. And it's not just about repairing the one thing. It's actually about how we reconsider our material culture as we are repairing. So there's some really nice research looking at the knock-on effects of starting with rethink and actually how then for consumers that then starts the conversation with themselves and about why is everything so easily broken these days, and it's knock-on effect of that. Anyway, sorry, that was a very rambling.
No, that was great. Thank you. And with slight technical issues, but I appreciate your patience with hearing the echo can always be challenging, as I mentioned earlier. But just to before I maybe wrap up, I want to go to Cristina on what we've heard so far. We have a couple of minutes before we're going to wrap up. But in particular, you know, if you could also reflect perhaps on the Euro elections coming up next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe one last time about inequalities. We really do believe that the lack of right to repair is also part of the debate, because when we keep extracting these raw materials from other countries, we destroy ecosystems and we also endanger communities to produce stuff that then just lasts very short here in Europe or in Western countries. It also has to do with global inequalities, and then it also has to do with inequalities, consumers versus manufacturers, that are consumers are a bit tricked in a way. So this absolutely has to do with inequalities, and our right to repair discourse definitely goes into this direction. And I would just invite anyone who is interested to just join us and help us make our voice stronger. Now, when it comes to the next mandate, maybe just to reflect back on the current mandate, the Green Deal, it was a great announcement, but unfortunately, if we look from an eco-design perspective, product policy perspective, oh my God, we have so much delay. There was so much that was announced, and unfortunately, so little that was actually accomplished. So this is a little bit, I don't want to be the disappointing person, but unfortunately, we have a huge backlog. So I just hope that the next mandate goes in the right direction and kind of speeds up all of this work, even though we know that there are capacity issues. So this would be our wish for the next mandate, to really speed up the backlog, to really that was accumulated.
Well, thank you very much. We're 1 minute past 2. Just some reflecting comments, and I want to sincerely thank all three of our speakers. I've taken a huge amount from this discussion, and I've learned quite a lot as well. I did not know about the extended producer responsibility fees in France, so that's great to know, and to hear about best practice that the EU can build on, magically enough, within its own union. But I think something that continued to arise in our discussion today was the question of framing this in a social dimension outside simply of one department or another, or simply about responsible consumption or production, but through the lens of equality and the lens of how we frame our intentions, I think was the phrase you used, Kersty, in one of your remarks there, and how we can address the co-benefits of serious revisions to our material approach to society in many ways. I think the question of incentives and of giving agency was something that we discussed, but recognizing, I think all three speakers did at various points, the limitations of consumer empowerment in the current context that we have. I think something that stuck with me was one of the first comments made about the action gap. It's funny because we talk a lot about the implementation gap in climate change, about setting targets and then actually implementing them and so forth. And perhaps the same is true in the case of the Circular Economy Action Plan, in terms of what we have now set out, and it was mentioned, we have all the solutions that we need, we know what to do, it's a matter of doing them now, and perhaps it's a matter of rephrasing the debate to try and stimulate that action. So I hope if in one small way this discussion today may encourage all of you to go out thinking about the ways in which we can accelerate this important whole of society, whole of economy discussion. And until the very next time, wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. And again, perhaps we can give a round of applause to our three terrific speakers. Thank you all.